Sat Sri Akal, Namaste, hello, and welcome to the show called The Truth Tribe. I'm your host, Ravi Tur, and today we are discussing public service, academics, community work, and politics. And we have just the perfect guest for all that. Member Parliament from Steveston, Richmond East, Member Parliament Parm Bains. Sir, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ravi, for having me, and thank you to, of course, all of your listeners for tuning in and listening to the important topics that you're bringing forward. I've had an opportunity to watch some of your focuses that you've had, and I think it's an amazing thing to bring and share forward stories of people from the community.
Thank you for your kind words, sir. Member Parliament, Mr. Parm Bains is a pivotal figure in Canadian politics. You stand as a beacon of dedication and community service. As a Member of Parliament from Steveston, Richmond East, your story weaves through varied academic pursuits and notable career milestones. With an intricate understanding of communications from Royal Roads University, coupled with hands on experience in aircraft maintenance from BCIT, you offer a unique perspective on your political journey. Your tenure in public relations and communications with BC government for 14 years, and later as a professor for Cornwall Polytechnic, has enriched your versatile career, making you an influential voice in the Canadian political landscape. You have served as the Vice Chair for Richmond Community Foundation and have been awarded the Innovation Award for Organizational Excellence by the Government of BC. You've also been named amongst the top 100 most influential Indo-Canadians by Vancouver Post-Sun Media and have been awarded the Community Service Achievement by Government of BC. We will be discussing all that and much more today. But to start us off, sir, in your own words, who are you and what do you do?
Well, ultimately, I'm a product of the community. I would say that my upbringing in Richmond was just truly a grassroots upbringing. I played a lot of sports and was involved in coaching and community from a very young age, and just being a part of a strong community in Richmond that was a small community. We still believe that it's a small town, and even though it's grown and it's a gateway to the economic growth of this country, but it still really is a small town and it has a really small town feel. So truly, I'm a product of the community and I'm a voice of the community, and in my view, I think that growing up. Being involved in team sports, volunteer opportunities, and things like that. I've just had a love for the community and making sure that the future of my family, living in the same community still from to this day, has the same opportunities and the same small town feel that I grew up in. So I sort of enjoy that, and that's really who I am.
That's wonderful. So to start this session off, I would like to start off at your academic career, something that I found really interesting and stood out to me. That is your initial days at BCIT spent doing aircraft maintenance. What sort of drove your decision to pursue that?
Well, it's an interesting. My path is very, I think and actually I'll start to the present time and go backwards because when I was teaching at Kwantlen and I was teaching communications, and you have young people of this generation, making decisions on the future of their lives, and I would tell them that, whatever you choose to do today, you probably won't be doing in the future. But being a communications person, I said this would be the most important class you would take because everything in life is about communicating, building relationships, and really that was where what what took me into the world of politics all the way from aircraft maintenance. Before that, I wanted to be an architect, and I was actually enrolled in BCIT to do engineering program, and I was doing some prerequisites. And at the same time, I was working as a baggage handler at Air Canada. Living in Richmond, it was one of the many jobs that were close by home, and being having the airport here, and it was a part-time position while I was studying. So, and I s- and a manager from work said, it was a part of an annual review of the employees, and they knew that I was studying and asked me like, "What are you studying?" I said, I wanted to go into building technology, which is an architectural program, and I'm in the engineering department right now. And they go, "Oh, we have an engineering department here in Canada. Uh, you already work for us, so it would be an easy transition if you did the aircraft maintenance program. You'd get a job in the hangar, $35 an hour to start." I was like, "Oh, it sounds pretty good to me." So I switched my program and went into aircraft and completed that, worked for a few years. And then there was some challenges. The industry was going through that at the time, and Air Canada was losing a lot of contracts, maintenance contracts. So ultimately, they had to reframe how they were doing things, and they shut down the hangar in Richmond, the Vancouver-based hangar, which was one of the largest, and they were asking people to reposition themselves into Calgary, Winnipeg, and Toronto, and I did not want to leave Richmond. So yeah, so yeah, and then my pathway right from there sort of began instantly into um, the world of communications, just because I was coaching soccer at the same time. I was very involved in the community. Not only coaching, I was young and I was still playing, and so I was very involved in the sports community in Richmond. And there were other challenges that we had at the time in the community. So we're talking about late '80s, early '90s. There was disproportionate number of youth that were involved in gangs, specifically from South Asian community. I mean, it was across the board in all communities, but it was something that was a disproportionate number in the South Asian community, that other leaders at the time came forward, and they were really speaking about it and trying to educate the community on those issues. And it was a community in denial at the time. I was just a young person. I was approached by um, uh, a community leader in Richmond who was going to be hosting a forum to raise awareness about the issue of gang violence and crime in our community, because I think it was in a matter of 10 years, we had lost 100
Oh, wow.
uh, young, mostly predominantly Punjabi Indo-Canadians at the time. I would say Indo-Canadians because it was a mix of different, cultural or religious backgrounds, but youth from the community, to gun violence, gang violence in 10 years. So it was like, so that really struck at the time. And if you do some research and you'll look back, you'll see a lot of those articles that will highlight how the Indo-Canadian community at the time was struggling with that reality of what's going on with the youth at the time. And it wasn't, I would say, like something that was, across the community where everybody was involved, like some of the media may portray, but it was significant just to the number of people we had in the community at the time. We were at that time probably a population of just over 300,000. So, you were also almost noticing a rise in gang activity within the community. So that rise needed to be addressed. Leaders came together. We had at the time, I believe, the Attorney General was Ojul Dosanjh, who was leading, the province, and the NDP government was leading the province for a decade at that time, and so there was significant elected officials that came forward. Dr. Gozar Chima, Wally Opal was a justice at the time, um, and uh, and uh, and then we had community leaders, who this was relatively new to them. So people wanted educators, academics to come forward and let's try to work on something here. And me just being at the time, I would say very young, by in my first year of post secondary academics, and coaching soccer. So I was approached to bring youth forward from the soccer programs and the clubs that I was involved with, just to sort of raise awareness to them. I attended the forum that was hosted in Richmond, and it was well attended by the community, concerned individuals. And actually, from there, they asked me to say a few words, and it was a divided community at the time. We were going through a lot of different issues. And I know I'm going into a little bit of history here, but I think it's an important piece of, you know, how our community developed and how leaders emerged from there. You had issues around, temple politics, um, things that were happening in India, still continuing to manifest here locally. Um, uh, and what ended up happening at the time was a community divided. You had people who were sort of in denial about what's going on with not only youth, but in within the community. Some people just didn't want to, uh, get involved. Let's say. So all of those things, coming together, I was actually approached by Dr. Gozar Chima, who was a minister state for mental health. He was an elected official at the time, but he wasn't in government yet. And then when he did come into government, he approached me and said, we need some people to get involved in. We need somebody from the community, young person who can liaise with the community, so we can work on reaching out and working on some of these issues that are happening. And then later he became the mental state for mental health minister, and asked me if I wanted to work with the BC government, so as a liaison. And it was just timing. I just left. I was on my way leaving Air Canada, and I had just left there, and I said, sure, I'll try it out. But and I just I'm not sure I have the complete experience in what you're asking me. But they're like, no, well, you're working already in coaching and all of these things within the community, so you know the community. Why don't you come and try it out? I spent a week with them, and then that was it. From there, then I transitioned into a liaison role within government. From there, I quickly transitioned. I was getting familiar with the role, and then added responsibilities were thrown my way, and I soon became not only a liaison, but a community outreach person, a media relations person, and so on. So from there, that was my transition into government. And then then once you're in government, you're learning the role. At the same time, you're learning about policy and more community, and how the inner workings of government are, and what and there, a passion grew to try to solve more problems, and work towards solutions on a number of community related things and other policy issues. So that was sort of my transition into government.
Very, very interesting. And there's a couple cool points that you touch on. The gang violence is one of them. I have it noted down, and we'll come back to it because I think that's definitely an issue that still persists in our community. So I would love to pick up your brain as to what is your understanding of the issue. But just in terms of your career, when you were working as a public relations for the BC government, how did your tenure, in your understanding, has helped shaped your understanding of public work and policies, and how has that helped you in your current role today?
Yeah, I think I'll just pick up actually just where we left off, because one of the first things I had done when I joined government and in my role was actually to work on things that I brought community together. So, how I talked about we had a divided community at the time. We had politics within temples where people were not willing to sit in the same room. So one of the first things I had done at the time was to bring the Solicitor General, Attorney General, other ministers, and MLAs together to combat the issue of public safety that we were having at the time with gang violence and all of these things. And bring in community leaders. And at that time, all of the temple leaders, it was the first time they had come back into the same room to combat a community or work towards together on a community initiative after maybe even over a decade where they hadn't, there was a split amongst the community where, at the time the phrase was called, the community was, let's say, split between traditionalists, fundamentalists, or moderates. And those terms were being used at the time. And then, they came together, and that was my first sort of, I would say, win, was to bring the community together to talk about this issue and work towards something. From there, formed a Sikh Societies of Lower Mainland umbrella group, which later became South Asian uh, Association Against Youth Violence, and it grew from there to include academic institutions. Kwantlen Polytechnic, they did some research around this issue, and and through that process, back to your question, I learned about, okay, what are the different aspects of policy that we can apply to solve these or work towards solutions on certain initiatives or certain issues that are happening, challenges. And it's so broad, right? You have a number of different ministries. And in that way, in my role, it was very unique because I was stationed in Vancouver, where most of the public relations people and the communications people were in the BC government were stationed in what we at that time was called the Public Affairs Bureau, later became the Government Communications and Public Engagement Division in Victoria. So with me being here in Vancouver, my role was to support not only the Premier's office but every minister and every ministry office. So you would have to, be at announcements or respond to um, ethnic media requests on every issue. So, making sure that, wherever we're going, we have issues notes available, what the topic of on mind is of the people that we're meeting with, and all of these things. So in essence, what ended up happening was my unique role allowed me to learn about every ministry and have an understanding of different files, and it helped me in moving forward and actually becoming more passionate about all of the things that government can do. And it allowed me to also learn about navigating through the various offices, each ministry, because typically you'll find people who've worked in, say, like a forestry ministry, and then they specialize in that, and that's all they really know. And then, whereas in my role, I was able to, uh, you know, pick projects or think of ideas and pitch things to the respective ministries, staff, and say, hey, what about this? Should we talk a little bit more about this? This is a great program, and I think that will be well received within the communities. So, it was so to sort of answer your question in a way where how the understanding of public policy and uh, if you look at the fact that every ministry has such a specific delivery of different programs, it's endless. You can get lost in a lot of that. So that was probably a very valuable, um, I don't know if it was inadvertently just because my role was such, like it was very valuable to my development as a public relations person and a public policy, a person that understood public policy and became passionate about it, really.
So when we talk about your political career, when you hear the word successful in the Canadian political landscape today, who's the first person that comes to your mind and why?
Well, that's a very tough question. I think, the first, I mean, I would say change makers, and I can only say that, you know, in politics, you have so many different, uh, there's one thing where you can say, okay, this was the first person elected from our community, right? And that opened doors. Someone like Mo Sahota, even Dr. Gozar Chima was one of the first elected MLA in Canada. Um, but it's a tough question. I think you put me a little bit on the spot here. Those are the first two people that came to my mind, I would say. So people who are the first. Um, and then I would say people who made significant changes. I really think that in public sphere, someone like Wally Opal, who was a Supreme Court justice, he really, actually made a huge contributions to policing and public safety by modernizing some things and really being vocal about how we should transition certain things. So, I think Wally Opal is a very important figure in Canadian, not only in the public sector, but he later became the Attorney General, and made major contributions there as well. So I would say Wally Opal.
Thanks for sharing that insight. Um, if you have to walk me through with a day in the life of a member parliament, what does that look like? When does your day start? When does it end? Does it ever end?
Well, it doesn't end, so I'll tell you that part, right? Because you're constantly, like when you go to sleep, maybe, but even then, you're sort of thinking of, what the next day is like. But look, it's a lot of different jobs that we have. So day in the life of a member of parliament is everything. It's community, it's public policy, it's committee work, it's house duty, it's responding to questions that Canadians want to know about, and ultimately, we have to constantly be thinking of like, what are we doing for everybody? What are we doing for Canadians? That's the day in the life of a member of parliament. Like, and I don't want to, scare people that, oh, it's a miserable thing or anyway, but I think I can only speak for myself. I think others have different ways of how they apply themselves into the role. I believe I come from a mindset of, problem solving. I've always sort of thought like, I think, we can do this better. We can do that better. And, I don't look at, who I want to help or, what areas. I think I have skills in certain areas that I have more knowledge about. And there's areas that I'm more passionate about for sure. But, it's the delivery of services and support, and at the same time, like how are we doing as a nation? Is our economy good? So like I would describe myself more as someone who's socially liberal to the point where we need to make sure people have the services and support that they need, but fiscally conservative to the point where we should ensure that we have a competitive country that has strong trade relations, and we're making money. That's sort of important to make sure that we can pay for the programs that we want to deliver. So a day in the life is thinking of all of those things, all of the above.
So when you're dealing with the situations which are tough and stressful, do you have any particular frameworks or policies in place that you apply to handle certain situations?
Yeah, I think the way everyone like the framework that I sort of employ is like, okay, every situation comes forward, every day is different, and we're tackling um, daily occurrences, some that are in our control and some that are out of our control. And for all of those, I would say that the best thing is, you have to assess the situation, what it is, and look at how we can tackle it the best way possible with what resources we have. We sometimes may not have certain resources to tackle it. And at that point, then we have to develop that and say, okay, we need to we don't have something in place to handle this. What should we do here? So that's the process. It's a process, right? Everything is a step by step process, and I think following a process is important. And so that's sort of how I would say that we tackle day to day situations that come our way.
If you have to talk about your riding of Steveston, Richmond, what would you say are the top 3 challenges that your constituents are facing today, and how do you plan to navigate them?
Yeah, I mean, the number one thing on everyone's mind, it's no secret, is affordability. So, the best way to tackle the issue of affordability, in my view, is to ensure people have good jobs, and we're continuing to generate opportunities, investment in not only our region but the entire country. So, um, number one. Um, Sort of solution to the issue of affordability, as I would say, is making sure people have access to good jobs. So that means young people need to have access to education. That means young people need to have access to, um, transit and all of these things to ensure they can get from place to place. And so, so those are the things that are on top of mind. And when I speak to the issue of affordability, and I said, some things are in our control and some aren't. We went through a very difficult position as a global issue with the COVID outbreak. I think we're still seeing the recovery from that in different ways. We've seen the recovery on the health side of it, and now the economic impact of it, where we dealt with the issue of no, like supply chain, no movement of goods. We've somewhat now recovered from there, and now we're seeing the impacts in a different form where you have the lack of goods and that lag of goods and the productivity uh, has now impacted our inflationary pressures. So those resulting things sometimes are out of our control. And then how we can tackle them is, we have to make sure that people can maintain jobs so they're able to, you know, uh, battle the impact of it and combat the impact that that's having on their lives, so they can continue to make sure that they are able to absorb the inflationary pressures. So that's good. Right now, where we in Canada, we have some of the lowest unemployment in Canadian history, and that ultimately, in a way, though, people are still spending. So we're trying to ensure that people, have an understanding that we need to everybody needs to really rein in some of the spending. And I talked about a little bit about the inflationary pressures and the reining in spending, and then we as a government have to also. So that's where you'll see where we have seen now in the last budget, or we've made significant you know changes to make sure that we as a government have to rein in some of the spending. um, some of the important pieces have to continue, healthcare and some of our national defense things, and other areas that are extremely important. Our national trade corridors need to make sure that they continue to move. So those investments will continue, but uh, but in other areas that we have to make sure that we can all control a little bit of the spending, and then and see that inflationary pressures come down. So affordability right now is at the top of mind, not only of government, of every person. So that's a huge thing. We're seeing a increase in the need for housing, which has been an ongoing issue. But I was in provincial government for over a decade, and that issue has continued to be something that's been a huge challenge for across Canada. I would say some cities have way more pressure than others, city centers. So back to affordability, housing, those are probably the top of two mine. And I've been passionate about that issue actually for a number of years, and I've brought forward some ideas, whether it's gentle density or other things. Um, but I would say that with respect to how much our colleagues and my colleagues have brought the issues forward in their respective communities. It's why we have like the first of its kind, the national housing strategy. Typically the federal government would work through the provincial governments and their housing organizations to work on those issues with the municipalities. But what we've done in the last recent years is to work, more directly with the municipalities to see what incentives they need to change some of their mindset on how they generate or allow for housing and densification of housing in their cities. Every city is very unique, so they have an idea of how they want housing to, be built in their cities, and it's important for us to work together. And that's the thing about Canada. You have three levels of government, and to ensure that things get done, actually get to the finish line, we all have to work together. So that's sometimes a big challenge. You have a massive country, a lot of different provinces, a lot of different municipalities, and each area is very unique in how they want things done. So that's the big balancing act that we have to work on with respect to the housing piece.
That's uh, that's actually very valid. All those reasons that you've listed out. I'm sure all Canadians are on board with what you have raised in terms of the concerns so far, and just a piece of different levels of government and having to work through that. Sometimes on the outside, we don't actually realize that we want the results, but we have to understand the process that allow those results to fall in. If I have to ask you, what will be your highest point in your career so far, and what did that teach you?
Well, I think, being elected to office, it's a huge honor to represent, my community. What did it teach me? It teaches me, it taught me ultimately, like, how important the work we're doing is in the lives of people because, you know, quite often, I think a lot of Canadians, generally, they work and they go about their day. They're raising their kids. They're involved in relationships, and they're for the most part, you know, day to day living their lives, and they don't really think sometimes about government and people governing. But but everything that they're doing in their day to day lives ultimately touches upon something that we're maybe responsible for directly or indirectly. So I think we see it. I see it in that way, and I'm learning a little bit more about that, and I think that that's probably a high point. Being able to uh, be in a position to try and solve some of the challenges that are there, and maybe make an impact in people's lives. And I remember when my during my election, one of the things that I wrote a letter to the electorate, the residents of Richmond at the time, was I said I just want people to enjoy their lives, and I truly do, and I want to. But I think when I see the pressures that people are facing, and you're trying to make sure that they can, that's something that I take home every day with me.
When we talk about politics, politics is not a bed of roses by any stretch of imagination. And then when you throw life on top of that, life has its own challenges. Um, if you're comfortable talking about it, the point I want to touch on is some of those challenges that you have faced recently with your health. I wanted to understand what was the situation and how has that changed your outlook on life and what did you learn from it?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking. I mean, I was very private about it because it's one of those things. I think I wanted. I'm pretty private about a lot of personal things, but I think it was one of those things where I actually didn't even tell my parents about the how the situation was evolving, and my health was deteriorating to that point because I mean My mom already calls me, 3 times a day. It would have been probably 10 by that, but if I had told her. But it's one of those things where you you you're going through it, and again, I'm a process person, so I had to sort of teach myself just mentally to say, it's sort of, I have to go through that process and allow for the experts to do what we have to do to get to where I need to be in a healthier position. And 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 I think that what I learned really through it was like how one thing, like how resilient maybe I was to a lot of different, things that were thrown my way. I knew at the time that it was a situation where I was born with a solitary kidney, and and I only realized that through like you recall when we talked about working at Air Canada, and we were going through a physical we all had to go through, and they discovered that I had, you know um, you know abnormally high blood pressure, some other indicators that I needed to go see my personal doctor. They started exploring. It wasn't they at the time, like, too something that was very for them, out of the ordinary, extraordinary. But they're like, oh, let's do some exploration. My family doctor did some work, and he only realized it through some blood work, and then finally a ultrasound to, and then I was 33, I think, at that time, but at that point, and so from then on, it was being monitored, and I was told at some point throughout my life I may need a new one, and maybe, post 50 or around 50, the age of 50. So it was getting to the point where it was deteriorating a little bit quicker, and they couldn't find anything in terms of wrong with the actual kidney that I had. It just was, so just not starting to work as well. So from that point, what ended up happening was, I had to make a decision, like, that, do I, continue on with, some of the potential career moves that I want to make versus not wanting to make. I had to make those decisions, and then, when I talked about it with my family and my wife, and I we came to the conclusion that if I didn't run for office at the time, because right before the election, I was still, pretty strong, and I felt like I was able to, get to where I needed to get to, but I wasn't realizing really that I was just so absorbed with the work and my job, and I was continuing to do it, and teaching at the university, and I wasn't really feeling the fact that my health was deteriorating. What typically happens in the later stages of that, when the kidney starts to fail, is fatigue starts to set in. So I didn't feel like I was still very actively doing a lot of different things, but it did start deteriorating, and I was changing, and my outlook was changing, and how I physically looked, and all those things. So I had to make a decision at that point where, like, can you go through the rigors of an election and all that? And my wife was like, you'll probably regret it if you don't go through with it. And then I just, I soldiered on and went through it, and I did it, and we ended up winning the election, and I was very, very, you know, obviously proud of that moment. But then, as soon as I started traveling, and my health just started getting worse and worse even quicker. So that's when I had to, speak to, our caucus whip, and I informed them that, my health is in this situation, and we were fortunate to have the hybrid parliament. So I was still able to go through treatment and do all of these different things and work like full time, with no setbacks at all. And quite frankly, when the dialysis piece came into effect, it actually brought me back. You start getting energy back because the process is that it cleans your blood out, and you're able to, you know, you know, be, have more energy and all of those things. So, that was huge. Again, then the medical experts and our healthcare providers did their job, and I was able to do my job. And then it was just honestly like a out of the blue situation where I was called one day by the hospital that's saying that there's a really good match for you, and I went in, and I went in, and in within 24 hours I had a new lease on life, you could say. Very grateful for that. Um, Throughout the process, it's just been almost like a dream, like, where you don't know what's happening and you're going through it and you're just working and you're doing your things. But I sort of told myself mentally to just put my head down and really focus on things that matter and do the work, spend time with family. And I did that. And that's really what got me through it.
I did read the piece where you were going into the Vancouver General Hospital, still 3 days to get your dialysis done, and you're still getting your work done. That sort of dedication, as all of us on the outside, all we can say is thank you for that commitment to your work, sir. Just changing gears here, let's talk about your childhood. Growing up in Canada, you grew up in a very different time. You are a father now, and it's 40 years later. What has changed in your understanding of Canada from when you were growing up to now? What are some of the evident changes, especially in your kids, do you see, or in the community, that you would like to share?
Wow, that's I grew up in the 80s in Richmond. So it was a time where there's still a lot of racism. I mean, our community's been here. I would say the Indo-Canadian community first set foot in 1897. A lot of it was the military, um, people who fought in the World Wars who first settled here. After visiting Canada, in their travels as soldiers, they, chose really British Columbia. A lot of the, you know, mostly people from Punjab, right, who looked at BC and saw the open fields, and they thought it was similar to home where they could farm, they could do things that they were familiar with. Um, and those pioneers sort of paved the way, through their hard work, and we are still viewed as probably one of the most hardworking communities in Canada. And if you look at uh, those communities were small, right? And then there was the big um, uh, transition, or I would say addition of more immigrants in the 70s, that came, that was my parents came in the 70s. My dad originally went to England in the late 50s, and spent some time there before he came here. And it was one of those things where uh, a lot of our Punjabi community came from England as well at that time, and Canada was being marketed as a place for opportunity, for people there. And so, I grew up in a city not too far away from where my office right now is. I mean, or a little neighborhood that where my office is literally 5 minutes from here, and I'm representing that area now. So that's a little bit remarkable. But to me, in my mind, it's sort of odd. But it, when we were growing up, it was a very working families type of neighborhood. Um, Sports and those kinds of things were big, and people playing in the streets, and all of that. To bring back some of that nostalgia, playing hockey in the cul-de-sac. But you know, it was a struggle just because we were a new community, right? And we were being called effing Hindus still. You get chased home from school by certain groups. And from there, you find ways to fight back, and I would say, growing up, you still have a little bit of a chip on your shoulder. You're trying to prove yourself that you're worth, being Canadian and all of those things. So you carry that, throughout your youth, and even into high school, and your friends, you know, but I would say Richmond sort of was a little bit of a mixed community. So there was some aspects, there the Japanese community it has a lot of heritage here. Uh, the Punjabi community on the north side of Richmond by the river, because everybody was working in the lumber mills, and the factories. My dad worked in the steel factory there, and so there was a lot of Punjabi community, and that, of course, the English community, Scottish, and others that were here. So, and I would say that, like, it wasn't a place where there was a lot of affluence, right? It was everybody was, working, jobs, and trucking, whatever, factories, things like that. So that was the community I grew up in, and it was probably a time where you become sort of your how the city is, is made up of. And Richmond, I would say, had really strong sports programs, so people were involved in a lot of that. And I still have friends I grew up with who we played together in certain, I played a lot of soccer, so that was sort of my game. But in other, there's football, basketball, all of those programs were really strong in this city, so there's a lot of that. Now, I would say, in comparison, you have, a lot of social media, um, and, instead of playing in the streets, you have so many different, like, academy programs now. So you'll see a lot of kids that are involved in a lot of different programs, but they're now either, in an organized fashion with this group or that group, and and I think Richmond still has that aspect. We have great facilities here, so I would say that the big difference really is, the growing up was, social media, and maybe a little bit more acceptance of the different cultural backgrounds that the kids come from now. So, like the pioneers that paved the way for, our generation and the generations before us, we've probably done that and opened some more doors for the next generation. And that's really what it's all about, and now the next generation, will need to do that, and hopefully some more leaders emerge from, this community, and do the same for the next generation. So that's sort of really that transition, I would say, that we've seen. And Richmond's become a very, very mixed community, and especially the area that I represent. We have some unique pieces here. We have, there's something that's called the Highway to Heaven. It's a 5 kilometer stretch in this city that has over 20 different faith-based institutions. So you have, uh, Gurdwara, Mandir, Masjid, Buddhist temple, Christian churches, multiple, all different types of faiths, all on one row, and and everybody sort of gets together. They're like right next door to each other, so everybody works together, and it's sort of become that type of a community. So it's very tolerant now.
That's a good point you added on there. That's something that I learned, and that's truly a reflection of what Canada is. Canada is not made by one community or one sector. It's an accumulation of all of us from different ethnicities, different groups coming together to work in this nation that we call our proud land. So thanks for that. Let's go back to one of the points we were discussing earlier: the gangs, drugs, and violence. You mentioned it's been something that's been a part of Lower Mainland, part of our South Asian community since the 80s. I would like to understand, in your experience, what are some of the reasons that the youth gets attracted towards that path? And why is it that these issues still persist within our society today?
It's actually a very simple answer. Acceptance. You, we will always be a society where people are trying to fit in, right? That'll never change. So the issue of, you know gangs, and and it's not so much like, you know a gang is formed, and they're just formed for no reason, right? It's organized, right? It's organized, and there's a recruitment piece that's involved there. And who do they recruit? Kids that don't fit in, people that are looking to, you know, be a part of something. So, I think now with even like social media, it's amplified a little bit more where people, and I'll sort of do a little comparison thing where before it was, you have kids who are excelling in academics. You have kids that are excelling in athletics. But what about the ones that are in between, right? What about, and how much focus was put? That's where the focus has to be. You have to put the focus on those kids that are in between because they need something to fill their gap of, I don't fit in with, these athletes. I don't fit in with all these smart kids. Who am I? What am I? And how much focus is given? Families were hard working. It was tough times, I would say. In the earlier days. Now people have a little bit more disposable income. People are putting their kids in various programs, whether it's the arts program, bhangra or dancing or something or some kids. There's more effort being put into families with their kids and where they're going, but there still is that gap that not all families have those luxuries or even the knowledge or the time to sort of know, hey, what's happening. People, you still have that. And I'll bring it back to sort of our community and that fabric and how it was. Like, when we were growing up, we had grandparents. Like my grandma was the one who was home, you know, making our lunches, making sure that, we were fed or whatever parents are at work. But I would say my parent, like my dad specifically and my uncles, they put a huge focus on sports for us. So we were very lucky for that. Me, my cousins, my friends in this city, very fortunate. Um, but then there's people like in the same situation where grandparents are doing that. Maybe they're working, and I'm using this is not just anecdotal evidence. It's things that I've spoken to in the community. You have people maybe working in the trades or other areas, and I don't want to single anybody out, but it's long hours. And then how much focus is being put on what the kids are doing? What's their peer interaction? Who are their friends? So, do you think, like, if I was to pose a question, like, say, if a grandma knows a group of boys have come over, or girls, or whoever have come over, that each they know exactly who each of them are, who their families are, and what they're up to? What they don't, right? They're just like, oh, kids came over, they went to play. Who are they? So there's a lot of you actually have to really focus on that aspect of peer interaction. Who are they associating with, and all of those? It's a lot of work, right? So,
Mhm.
so those are the big challenges, and this is a lot of the work was done through Kwantlen Polytechnic. I mean, from those groups I mentioned initially that formed the umbrella organizations, academics that came in. If you look at that, if you look at how much um, uh, the studying at that point was done to sort of see what is the issue, because some of these people that are involved are from strong families that are working, and they have things they're not. It's just a lot of the youth need somewhere where they need to fit in, and the comparison to today with the social media, it's the same thing. you know you have how many likes am I getting, how many shares, or how many who's how many friends do I have, followers do I have, and all that. So there's a little bit of you have those maybe youth that are preoccupied with other things, athletics, academics, and other programs that they're involved with, art, you name it. But then those ones that don't, and they're lost in that, maybe the social media, where they're finding acceptance there from whatever they're engaged with there. So that piece of acceptance, and self worth in society, it's a natural, phenomena. So
Mhm.
that as long as that persists, there'll be vulnerable people to be taken advantage of by organized um, crime, right?
Mhm.
Because there's money to be made. You have like, we talk about drug use, and then that takes us into, mental health, and you know people feel pain in many ways, and then they want to feel good. It's about feeling good or feeling bad, and that gap needs to be filled. It's being filled to the tune of billions of dollars. So it's not like, sometimes people look at the issue of, say, drug use, and oh, it's the downtown east side. The downtown east side residents, a couple of thousand or whoever that are in that, you know, that in the doldrums of, say, mental health and drug use and addiction and all those things. They're not spending $13 billion on drugs. It's everyone. There's an insatiable appetite um, for for illicit substances, and they're coming in so many different forms. So that gap needs to be filled to basically feed that drive for feeling better. There comes in organized crime. Then comes in how do we need soldiers? We need people on the ground to make sure that they're peddling it. And who are those people? It's those people who are looking for acceptance somewhere, and they're being recruited. So that's that cycle of what's taking place, and then forms groups, and it's not and gangs, and then comes violence and all of that because of territories and all of these things. So that's sort of the reality of it. Do I believe that um, we can solve it, or we know the problem, where it's something that we have to keep fighting. It can't stop. So if we can save one kid, two kids, 10 kids, we don't count the ones we save, right? We only count the ones that are gone. So that is the big challenge, and I think that we have to continue to fight it. And I know this conversation is a little bit more about uh, like a broader, higher level look at it. But there's things that we are doing as a government, like whether it's giving more resources to our borders, combating some of the gun issues. Um, and there's guns that are being ghost guns, things that are being made. Drugs aren't being just imported; they're being made here. They're being processed, and chemicals are being used. So there's a lot of it's a big fight, right? And the governments, and not only ours, but all governments will continue to have to keep fighting it and combating it in different ways. We have to be clever. We have to be creative on how we do it. So that's in a nutshell that the issue of the gangs, drugs, crime, and things associated with it. Sadly, mental health, right? It again is a byproduct, and even the root cause of a lot of this.
It absolutely is. I think you put it perfectly. Mental health, you touched on that a little bit. In your role, you always have a lot of things going on, a lot of stressful situations. How do you go about your mental health? Are there any particular practices you put in place? How do you stay mentally fit?
Sometimes there's no answer. Like, I don't know, but I would say that my way of doing it is I teach myself that, look, everything there's a process. So I have to accept if something comes that's unsettling, to that I feel is unsettling and I don't feel good about it. I accept it for that moment, and then I just try to deal with how I'm gonna, process it. And I literally tell myself that time, right? You'll have to take the time to get over whatever that situation was, and whatever you're feeling. And then I go through my own process. I just process things in a way that I know that, I'm an optimistic person. I always think that there's always a solution to everything. I don't think there's any problem that can't be solved or tackled in some way. So I basically trained myself to think that way, and that's sort of what I do.
If you could put something on a big billboard for every Canadian to see, what would that be and why?
Well, that's a good question. So for every billboard, for every Canadian, for every billboard, I would say that uh, there's I would just truly say let's work together and make sure that Canada remains the best country that it is.
That's perfect. I think that's a great advice, and all of us can learn from that. Um, if I have to ask you, what advice would you give your 20-year-old self, having gained all the experience in life that you have? What would that advice be?
Get things done earlier, maybe. I took my time. I mean, everybody's different, but you know, at 20, I feel like I maybe wasted, procrastinated a little bit too much, and but at the same time, I probably enjoyed life, a lot more at that time, maybe more than necessary, but it's something that I would say actually one of the regrets I would have is that I didn't uh, continue to have a little bit more focus on the academic side and getting things done a lot earlier. Um, I feel that I did probably waste a couple of years just not applying myself. So that would be my biggest advice.
What does the future looks like for you? What do you have in the works? Any future plans?
Well, the future is that, right now my priorities are ultimately what the priorities of this community here are. Like I've made those my key priorities is trying to identify some of the projects that we want to get done for this city and just working to get those done. And then, I do, it's not that I don't think, long term or short term, but I do feel that um, it's important for me to ensure that like some of the things that foundations that we've laid for priorities for this city do get done in the coming years and I've made a commitment to run in the next election to make sure I can see some of those things through as well. So that's my sort of near future. And after that, we'll have to reassess and see what happens. I'm in a position, maybe not like so many people, but that we don't have the luxury sometimes to make super super long term plans because as elected officials, you, you could have you could be in office and you can be out of office just like that. So that's sort of where I'm at. My commitment right now is to this city and to the area that I live in, and I've committed to them. Not whenever the next election is at that point, and then we'll see after that.
If I have to ask you, for those interested in joining public service and politics, what are the top 3 qualities for an impactful leader? What would those be?
I think you have to have passion and you have to have ideas. A problem solving attitude. Um, uh, you have to be thick skinned, um, and you have to be ready to work. Those are the key pieces.
Thank you. Sir, it's been a pleasure today sitting down here with you, talking to you, understanding how you work and go about your day. I'm confident that I learned quite a bit today, and I'm sure the listeners would have learned a lot, and they would be able to take those actionable insights and apply into their day-to-day lives. And together, as you said, work all of us together for a collective, better community. Before I let you go, any uh, final parting thoughts that you have for the listeners and for myself?
No, thank you, Ravi. I think it was, the interview process itself and talking about these things. Actually, I think it's a good start to my day for sure. Um, I think it's important actually that I know that people um, sometimes don't get a chance to just sit down and talk to someone about just general life because there's a lot of hustle and bustle, and people have to, get to work and do other things. But I would say take a break sometimes and just reflect on things. I would say do that. Other than that, my big message to everyone really is that care for one another, care for the area you live in is really important, and be passionate about the fact that we do live in a great country, and there's a lot of opportunity here for us to do great things. So just be kind to your neighbors, really.
That's perfect. Thank you for that, sir. Again, good luck with everything that comes in your future. We wish you all the success, and hopefully we'll chat soon again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. All the best with you and your program too.